Seb.
Great, thank you. So it's very nice to meet all of you. So this is my first time here. So my name is Seb Barre. I've been working in software and kind of on the internet for like over 25 years. I've been in tech and product leadership roles for the last 10 years. I'm currently the digital platform product lead at Telus. We are a telecommunications company, but also a health and consumer products company here in Canada. I also advise a few early stage startups on technology and team building. So I've worked in all types of companies, from startups to consulting agencies and enterprise. So today we're here to talk about Copilot. And so before I get into sort of Telus's experience with Copilot and our journey to getting to where we are today, I'm just going to do a really quick overview, just making sure that level set on what Copilot is. So it's an AI-assisted pair programmer. So we've all heard of ChatGPT and these types of tools that kind of can create text for you. Copilot is a large language model specifically designed to write code. So it gives you suggestions for anything from individual lines of code all the way up to complete functions. And the latest version will even analyze an entire file of code if you ask it nicely. So it is a more or less a groundbreaking productivity tool. To all developers, we all know that writing code is sort of the tedious part of the job. Even though it's fun and it's creative and you enjoy what you do, it's a lot, right? There's a lot of work. Code bases are only getting bigger. Timelines only get shorter. So obviously, when Copilot was first announced, every developer out there, I think, at some point looked at it and was like, can I use this? Does this make sense for me? And so conversations around Copilot started a long time ago at Telus, right? We started hearing about it. We use Slack and GChat, productivity type tools that everybody uses, and developers are always in there. And so there was a lot of informal discussions happening between developers. They were asking each other, are you using it? Am I allowed to use it? Should I use it? Is it any good? People started asking their managers, the biggest question being, am I allowed to use this, right? And because at the beginning, it was unclear, much like ChatGPT, what does the system or what does the service do with the information you provide it? Like the nature of these systems is that you have to give it access to your work so that it can analyze and understand what you're working on to give you suggestions. And so as a large enterprise company that works on proprietary things and takes privacy seriously, as a company, our default position on new products that we haven't evaluated is no, you can't use this, right? Especially if we don't know how it works it's not clear to us what is being done with that data. So most of these large language models, especially Copilot at the beginning, there was controversy around how it was trained. But there was a lot of companies and a lot of open source teams that were like, because GitHub basically came out and said, we trained this on all of the code we have, or most of it, public repos at least. But there was questions. People started finding snippets in the suggestions coming back, and they're like, this is coming straight out of a code file that I can identify that doesn't have a permissible license. So there's exposure and there's potential liability for a company using it. We have to think about that. As a company, we already sort of have policies in place around what our developers can manually do with things like Stack Overflow or with open source projects, how things get pulled in, what type of snippets of code they can use. So here, suddenly you have a tool that does it automatically and transparently for you, and for better or worse, gives you no attribution. So when Copilot suggests a function or suggests an auto-completion, it doesn't tell you where it got that idea or where it got that code. So that starts to get risky. That starts to get a little bit unknown. And as you all know, enterprise is not a big fan of risk, not a big fan of the unknown. So it was really important for us to start looking into this fairly quickly, because the other side of this is that people are going to use this, right? Like the doors are open on GPT and on AI and all of that. And the idea that as a company, you're going to tell people you're not allowed to use this, people are just going to use it anyways, right? In any large company, somebody somewhere is going to say, I'm going to use this on my own, or I'm going to sign up for a personal account, which is what we were finding, just through informal conversations, that a lot of people were saying, well, I'm just paying the $20 a month and I'm using this and it's great. So we decided at that point that, we couldn't just kind of put our head in the sand and say, like, we're not going to do this. So there was also a lot of excitement, right? As at even all the way up at a leadership level at our VPs and our executives were looking at this and they're like, this is the future. This is productivity. This will help us deliver more in less time. And so we really, we took Copilot, and what we did is we sort of did two paths. We started down our standard process of security and privacy review. As a big company that deals with consumer data, we take privacy very seriously. And so we have a fairly robust process for evaluating both the security and any kind of data and privacy concerns around any new product. Thankfully, we have a long-standing relationship with GitHub and with Microsoft, so that made some of this a little bit easier. But we also started a small internal pilot with about 25 people. And there were very clear guidelines around what they could and couldn't do and what code they could work on. And we established a system where we basically had a weekly, almost like a retro, where everybody talked about the good and the bad things that they'd gotten out of Copilot. What worked well, what didn't work well, we always try to ask people, tell us something that surprised you, which was a really good way to kind of elicit feedback. We didn't want people to keep like a log or a diary or anything like that during the week, but it was, if you just ask somebody like, what were the good points, then they would just say, well, I wrote more code, right? And so, but when we asked people, what surprised you, then it was always interesting because they would typically have a really good story about something that Copilot did that they were not expecting it to be able to do. And so we started that. And by having these two tracks, we were able to gather real world data and really understand how this tool could be used specifically at Telus, while at the same time going through all the checks and balances and all of the standard processes to make sure that that this was something that was safe for us to use as a company. As it turns out, GitHub has a product called Copilot for Business. And so if you sign up, as an individual, if you go sign up for Copilot today, you're signing up for Copilot for individuals. So the way that it manages the data, what it keeps from the usage that you make and how it uses that data is different than Copilot for Business. So you have stronger guarantees if you use Copilot for Business around the fact that the code that you're giving Copilot access to will not be fed back into the training model. It does not keep prompts and suggestions, and you have a little more control over that. You also get a lot more data and information as a business around the usage of Copilot, which is something that I'll touch on in a little bit, and turned out to be something very important for us. Because one of the things that we figured out very quickly is that anytime you have a new product, lots of people get excited about it. Lots of people want to get access to it. Lots of people want to play around with it. That doesn't mean they're going to keep using it, after they tinkered with it for a few hours. And Copilot for Business is $19 in Canada, at least. It's $19 per user per month. So not that expensive when you balance that against what a developer costs you hourly as a company, but at the same time, not zero. And so that was something we had to sort of figure out. So we went through that process, and as we started to get more and more confident that our analysis from a data and privacy and security perspective was going well, and that this was going to get to a good place, we started growing the size of our testing group and started allowing more people, and to the point where we ended up with a bit of a waiting list of people wanting access to it, and people from all over the company. Right, we had junior developers asking for access all the way up to VPs. Right. And at first we had one VP in particular ask for access, and everyone was a bit like, I'm not sure about that. And then he turned out to be one of the most active people in the group. He sort of, as he said, he dusted off his coding chops and started writing automation scripts and started getting back into the, to coding, because that was his, sort of his early days of his career. So it is really a really productive tool for lots of different people. I think at the beginning we think of Copilot as a bit maybe of a tool for junior developers, right? I think that's the first thing that people think of, is like, oh, this can help a junior, answer questions and free up the time of senior developers that are more traditionally the mentors or the pair programmers for a junior. You pair somebody up with a senior. There's a line I always use, that every junior developer needs a senior developer, right? You can't just be a junior developer and figure stuff out on your own. And so Copilot seems like an obvious, kind of automated assistant for that. What we've found is that Copilot is also very useful for rusty seniors, is sort of the term that we've come up with, right? You have solution architects that, and I think in large enterprises, solution architects are, people with lots of experience and who are often tasked with kind of tackling the bigger problem and figuring out the direction of things. But it's really easy for a solution architect in an enterprise to start working on this and end up in meetings and plannings, and you're doing diagrams. And the next thing you know, it's been a few years and you haven't written a line of code in a while. And imposter syndrome can sit in, and then at some point you realize, like, do I still know what I'm doing here? And so I will admit that I fall in that category. And so Copilot is really nice for that, where if you know what you want to build and you know the code you want to write and you have a good sense of what you're trying to accomplish, but you haven't written code that often or that much anymore, you can kind of jump in and Copilot will start to recommend things, and it'll get you back into the flow of things a lot easier than having to open a documentation site in another tab. And I think that was a surprise. Yeah, that was definitely a surprise for us, I think, and some of the feedback we got from a lot of the users in the test group were around that. So I'll pause here. Any questions? I'm going to go into a little bit more about like some specific learnings and things that Telus has figured out as part of this test, but I'll just want to pause to see if anybody have any
I think
questions.
so far so good. Rusty fingers.
So going into this a little bit. So the biggest use cases we've found so far, and to be fair, like our test group has grown now, but we're still, obviously we're still not widespread use. This is targeted teams that are using this within some very specific boundaries. I think the most useful things that we've seen based on feedback we've gotten is not really kind of writing inline code day to day. And a lot of those cases are developers. They know what they want. They know what they're doing. And some of the feedback we've gotten is that actually when you're trying to write the main code that you're doing, Copilot can actually kind of get in the way sometimes. And the suggestions it will make sometimes aren't really what you want because you're very opinionated about the code you're writing. So one of the biggest cases has been tests, right? Like writing, basically pointing Copilot at some code and saying, write me a unit test for this. I'll get back to it after about the dangers of that as well, and some of the policies that we've got in place where essentially you can't have Copilot write the code and write the test. A human has to write one of the two. Another big one for us has been automation and scripting. So the idea of like, write me a script that parses all of these files and extracts all of this kind of thing, and then Copilot will generate a script to do that, and then you tweak it to finish it off. One of the really interesting uses. So we are Telus is a GCP sort of customer, I guess. Like all of our cloud journey is, we have things in other clouds, but we have a long-term relationship with Google. And so the majority of our applications run in GCP. And GCP is very configuration based. If you think of Kubernetes and a lot of these other tooling that all the GCP tools are built around, Copilot has found a really good use in generating configurations for GCP. So one of the things, even though you may not think of it as code, all of the YAML and all of the boilerplate and everything, then the Terraform code that you need to basically do infrastructure as code or to configure, your clusters and all that stuff, Copilot is very good at that. You can sort of just ask it. You can either point it to an existing configuration and ask it to modify it, or you can tell it to generate brand new configuration for you. One of the other uses, which is more for Copilot X, which is the new version that is only in limited beta. We have a very small team that is participating in that right now. But the latest version of Copilot, one of the really cool things that it does is that when you have it plugged into your IDE like VS Code, it can watch your error output. And so you can basically tell it, explain this error to me or fix this error for me. VS Code always has a little thing with a linter where you can fix very basic errors like syntax errors or small things like that by just kind of clicking on a button. Copilot can now, there's also a fix with Copilot button now that shows up in the little drop down in your error log. And it can make it really easy to sort of, if you have a problem with your code, to just have Copilot fix it for you. It still requires a click. It's not automated. But so those are, I think, some of the most common use cases we've seen, other than the standard stuff of it just makes me more productive. It writes good code. We did a poll at one point around how our developers use Copilot, and it's very interesting. So 75% of our developers will only accept a suggestion if the line looks completely correct. And they're like, okay, I can use this line. Otherwise, they reject it. 25% said they will accept a somewhat incorrect line and then just fix it themselves, which is interesting. I think that's something that we maybe didn't think of immediately. That you could use it to, to kind of save a bit of time, and it gives you an initial suggestion, then you sort of fix it. Overall, we've I think our latest stats, I have them broken down by language, but it's about 28 to 30% is the average acceptance for suggestions. So 1 out of 3, which isn't bad, but it's been going up. As we've added more people to our group, the actual acceptance goes up. The lowest percentage is configuration languages like JSON, where I think maybe Copilot struggles a little bit more because it's less about logic and more about data, and that's harder for a system to wrap its head around. The largest acceptance comes from TypeScript and Ruby. So I think maybe more structured languages or languages that have less vagueness in them JavaScript is 25%, so it's right in the middle. It is our most popular language that most people work in. And then we've seen about, I think, 27% for Python, which is close enough. But so it's all hovering around the average. So 1 out of 3, let's say 1 out of 4 suggestions is about the rate that we've seen in our tests. And that apparently lines up. So GitHub provides us with industry stats to compare against, just to see where we're at. And we're matching industry stats. So it seems to be about the same for everyone. So that's kind of like the main use cases and some quick stats. To get into the challenges that we ran into and some of the things that that were a bit problematic at the beginning. The biggest one that I alluded to a little bit at the beginning was getting people to stop using their personal licenses. I think, we moved as quickly as we could, but as a large company, there's still a lot of things that take time. And I think when Copilot came out, a lot of people were just quick to jump in and see productivity. So trying to get users to stop using their personal license and start signing up for the business thing was a challenge for a few reasons. One, people are already set up, they're doing what they like. The other one is that the license cost. So developers were asking their managers or directors, can I get in on this? And in some cases they were told, oh, well, only if it's free. So we are the central sort of ops team and cloud COE team is actually right now eating the cost of all the licenses. We haven't started charging back to other teams, but we will do that soon because I think the value is there. But definitely, I think in a large company, trying to get your pilot kind of centrally funded will probably be easier than going around and telling developers, hey, you can come join the pilot, but you need to get your manager or your director to pay for it. I think that'll be a little tricky for some teams. One of the other challenges we ran into is as a large enterprise, a lot of our work happens behind a VPN. We have an internal network, and so for better or worse, you don't have a ton of access there. Getting Copilot to work properly through our VPN was a little bit tricky at the beginning, but we did have a few people figure it out, and then it was kind of a bit of a crowdsourced solution that came back, and then just disseminating that information out, took a bit of time, but now we've got a pretty good solution working. One of the challenges we ran into during our data and privacy evaluation is the idea that the AI is a black box, right? As most of them are. And I think our data and privacy team were asking us questions around how does this work, right? And where does it find the stuff? And a lot of that information is not super clear. And GitHub and Microsoft are, obviously they will share some amount of information, but they were still fairly cagey with us about exactly how the model works. So that's something that, that maybe as a team or as a company, you need to sort of accept that you're going to trust in the model and that you're going to trust the assurances you get. As I mentioned, Copilot for Business has stronger assurances. For us, that as a product gets tied into our larger agreements with these companies. So, that gives us a bit of a, I guess, comfort in some ways. Another challenge that we had was maintaining engagement. So I talked about this a little at the beginning. Big new exciting thing, very cool product. Everybody's heard about this. Everybody wants to try it. So we had lots of people coming in and saying, "Yeah, I want to try this." And then we would add them to the pilot, start paying for it. And then through our engagement numbers that we can look at, we realized at one point that we're like, well, out of everyone who's in the pilot, we only have about 60 people who are using, or 60% who are using it daily. Right. And so there's a lot of people that signed up for it, played around with it, and then haven't touched it since. Right. And some developers, some of them were more directors or managers. So definitely something to keep an eye on. We've come up with a process right now where we're not sure how we're going to do this. One of the concerns we're having once we roll this out more widely is, a director or a manager saying, get my team signed up for this just in case, right? And put all my developers in it. And then whether they use it or not, but they want to have it in case they need it, or out of some fear that we're going to run out of seats, or that, that they won't have it when they need it. So we're trying to figure out, we're exploring a few ideas around how that will work, and if there are ways to incentivize people to either use it if they have it, or if they don't, or only get it when they need it, right? And I think that's a challenge. But again, GitHub provides really good engagement data and really good sort of analytics and statistics around usage. So it should be pretty easy for us to figure that out. I'm sure at some point we'll put automation in place around it, where maybe you start getting notifications if you're not using it, and eventually you just get rolled off of the program if you haven't used it in long enough. But that's definitely something that we're looking forward to, or we're looking to the future and figuring out how we manage that growth. In an organization that has thousands of developers, at some point we don't want to be paying, $19 a month a user for thousands of people if we only have hundreds of people using the product. Another conversation that has started, but nothing tangible yet because it's still very early days for us, is the idea of brain drain and potentially accountability for AI generated code. You know, obviously, the more you use this, at some point there's you know, I think unfounded, but there's fear in conversations around the idea of like, you just get to a point where your developers don't really understand the code they're writing because they're pulling too much of it out of these Copilot models. Haven't seen that happen so far. It hasn't really been like Copilot is not at a point where it can write, you know, a majority of the code that you're building. It's really there to autocomplete or to make suggestions in small things. As the developer, you're still the brain in charge. You're still deciding what the code can do. But it's obviously, you know, kind of this tool will get better and better, and it will get to the point. There's already experiments out there that people are building small tools based on GPT, not necessarily Copilot, where you describe a program and it will generate a code base for you. You know, as opposed to just filling in the blanks on a file. Like those things exist already. That, you know, they work. Some work better than others, but we're heading there, right? So we do have to have conversations around that, around how do you make sure that if we get to a point where that tool, you know, if you get to a day where, oh, Copilot's having an outage today and it's going to be down for the next 24 hours, are your developers going to be like, I don't know what to do? So you want to make sure you don't find yourself there. We also talk about accountability. You know, like we said before, like what happens if AI generates the code and AI generates the tests and it turns out that both are bad, right? And something goes wrong and you have an outage. What do you do in that case? How do you prevent that? How do you still have checks and balances in place for AI generated code? I think it's the same thing we have today. Good unit tests, good accountability, good assertions, you know, developers that look at their code and things like peer review and code reviews and things like that. I don't think any of that stuff goes away, and I don't think Copilot replaces any of that either. So those are some of the, I guess, some of the challenges or some of the conversations that we're having around this. So
that's great. Thank you so much.
Last couple things, I'm just being mindful of time here. I'll talk a little bit about the new version, the Copilot X, which is also sometimes referred to as Copilot Chat. Some of the really cool things that it can do. The most obvious one is you ask it to explain code. So you open a file of code somebody else has written, and you basically ask Copilot, explain this to me. And it will write out a couple paragraphs of text, and it will tell you exactly what that file of code does. Some of the less obvious things that we've seen that are really cool and some that some people have done is re-implementing things in different languages. So we had somebody basically take a bunch of scripts, a bunch of bash scripts, and say, you know, hey, write me this in JavaScript instead, right? Or vice versa, or, you know, so to asking it, how do I something that was implemented in language X, I want it in Y, and Copilot Chat will basically translate it for you. Asking about the difference between things. So not even in terms of writing code, but if you're used to, say, OpenShift, right, which is a Red Hat product of managed Kubernetes, and you're moving to just, you know, bare metal Kubernetes, you can basically say, hey, I've used the OC command, the OpenShift console command, to do things, and this is what I used to do. How do I do this with kubectl? And Copilot Chat will explain to you the difference. This is a real use case that's happening for us as we migrate away from an OpenShift instance. So that's something that, you know, one of our users did. So that the chat feature, I think, is really going to change things a lot, because as opposed to just writing code for you, it's conversational, right? You can ask it questions. It can reason about code or about documentation or other things, and it can teach you things. So, yeah, the last thing I'll say is the early versions of Copilot were based on GPT-3, so it wasn't quite as good. The new version that's based on GPT-4 is remarkably better. So if you have anyone in your organization, or if yourself, if the last time you looked at Copilot was 3-4 months ago, it's changed a lot. It's gotten a lot better. So yeah, I guess I'll pause there since we have a few minutes left. I don't know if there's any questions.
Exactly. I think, Andrew, did you want to ask something?
Yeah. So my biggest concern with Copilot is what you mentioned right up at the top about attribution. The idea that I could use a snippet of code, which could then get my company into trouble down the road because we didn't have a license for it. How do you handle that or avoid that, or what did Telus do for that? Because everything else sounds remarkable and wonderful, and I'd love to have it, but it's really hard to get past the part where you might end up in court.
I mean, in some ways, the liability side is covered somewhat by the license agreement we have with with Copilot, you know, at the kind of the assertions they make in their license and their terms of service. But at the end of the day, you have the same problem today without Copilot, with developers going to Stack Overflow or copy pasting, you know, cargo culting code out of some other GitHub repo, or, you know, even I've seen situations where people, you know, developers come to a new job and bring a disk full of the code they wrote at the previous job, right? And so that's a risk that I think every company faces no matter what. And Copilot's not going to make that easier or harder. In fact, it might make it a little bit easier just because of the, you know, the terms of use and the kind of the license agreement you have with, like with GitHub or with, you know, Microsoft. So I was going to say USB.
Perhaps you can, perhaps you can briefly talk to the engagement stats that you alluded to earlier. Are you seeing any differences throughout the week, like a lot of engagement Monday and Friday afternoons, or vice versa?
The opposite, actually. The engagement stats are really like
Surprise.
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is the highest engagement, but I think those are also the most productive days. At Telus specifically, we try to batch our meetings on Mondays as much as possible to give our developers and our makers as much free space in the middle of the week as possible. Yeah, so we still try meeting Mondays as much as possible. It's harder in a remote world. And Fridays are Fridays are meeting free by design. And so most of our developers don't have meetings on Friday, which is interesting that we don't see as much use on Fridays. But yeah, right now it kind of looks a bit like a pyramid for the week with in terms of usage. So.
Cool. I think that's pretty much all we had. Thank you very much, Seb. That was amazing and impressive. Also, 30-minute of engaging, telling us about your experiences, the challenges, the recent developments, Copilot X licenses, everything else. Anybody has an additional question, comment, reflection? I think we do have a minute for that. Ingrid, I saw you on the call from Oslo. So far, so good?
Yeah, I think this was a fantastic run through, and I'm just kind of going through it in my mind.
Waiting to get access.
Yeah, waiting to get access, and also going through it in terms of the recent AI guidelines that has been released in our company.
I'll second that. Thank you very much, Seb. We're right on time. Thank you so much for taking the time, for doing this, for sharing your experiences so openly. I really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, thanks again, everybody. It was great to.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.